Hey, everybody, welcome back to the 2022 West Virginia Cybersecurity and Game Developers Expo. I'm here with David Tackett, who is actually the CIO for the West Virginia Secretary of State's office, and he's been there 29 years at this point in information technology. Well, he's in his 29th year in information technology, and he's overseen several process and application modernizations, assisted with the office pandemic adaptations, which I'm sure a lot of people in the state have had to deal with that, and also aided in the transition of elections technology into the U.S. critical infrastructure. And I do believe today that's going to be one of your big focuses, talking about the history of election and voting stuff and how it seems like more and more and more, as you said in your topic, the election managers are having to become IT managers, basically. So, Mr. Tackett, I will go ahead and hand it on over here to you.
Great. Well, Patrick, thank you very much for having me as a presenter. It's my privilege to talk to another group about something that I'm very passionate about, and I think that starts at the top from my secretary, Secretary Warner. A little bit about my history. As Patrick said, this is my 29th year in information technology. I started out as a tech. I started with IBM. So I'm a bit of a dinosaur in the fact that I like when screws hold things in place, not plastic fingers. I was a road warrior for about 10 years as a technician. Again, started out with IBM in the point of sale industry, moved to a third party service contract vendor that eventually wound up maintaining mostly just high-end servers, enterprise servers, SANs. I was a Dell certified systems engineer. Worked on Hughes Network satellite systems, commercial satellites, Motorola routers. Pretty much had West Virginia as a territory for most of that 10 years. In 2005, I came to the Secretary of State's office. We'll talk a little about my first role when I get through the sort of the history of it. But I've been here since 2005. I started out as someone in elections technology, and in 2017, I became CIO. I am in my fifth administration at the Secretary of State's office with my third secretary. Secretary Warner is the third secretary. So um, a very hardware systems oriented career for the first half. Second half has turned into a very branded industry in elections technology, as I said. And I've watched that industry brand itself and change over the last several years. And as Chris May, who gave a tremendous presentation earlier, he set me up for a lot of the concepts that I'll discuss in my presentation, but I am one of those 30,000 foot view managers now. I don't pretend to know everything that you know. I don't pretend to know everything that my staff knows. Um, I have a stable full of Mustangs and they run races and they make me look great. So I'm very much that 30,000 foot view manager, herder of cats. My department is very small here at the Secretary of State's office. I have 4 employees that report to me. I like to call them my dining room table. Each one of them is a leg in my dining room table. And if I lost one of those legs, the food would slide off their corner. I have one developer who's a full stack guy, very smart, very capable. I have one guy who is my senior systems and network administrator. I have one help desk and web and content management specialist. And I have one cybersecurity specialist. So very specific areas of focus. I trust them a lot to operate without instruction. My secretary is a 23-year military guy, so the chain of command is very important in our structure now. You hire and you retain people that you trust. and you delegate the authority, and it's worked very well for me, for my staff, for us here. We're a small office. We have about 50 or so full-time employees. So as the state government structure goes, we are relatively small, but we have some very important duties in our office that range from elections to business and licensing to administrative law. Um, and a lot of the governor's executive order structure falls in our wheelhouse. And my office, as you can tell, is not very decorative. It's not very pretty. I'm actually in the basement of the Capitol. I'm right under the big dome. I'm actually right under the governor's office. So the governor is right above my head, and I'm in the basement, but I kind of like it down here. Keeps me away from the things that happen on the first and second floor, which a lot of times can be interesting. One of the first things I said when I started at this office was um, technology and politics are strange bedfellows. What I do typically is black and white, ones and zeros. It may get spray painted red, blue, green, purple. So, although you may hear elements of politics in my presentation, I'm not a political hire. I'm not a political person, and all opinions are my own. Yada yada yada. Um, with that, I will start with this first slide, sort of give us an introduction. Election officials as IT managers. I put that trademark there because that phrase was actually coined by a gentleman several years ago, um, and it's representative of how IT has become a very large part of election administration and the process of elections. When I first started in this office, I was a technologist. I was again a hardware systems guy, but I didn't really know anything about elections other than going to the polls and voting. So, as Chris, alluded to, you may have a technical skill set, but when you land in a particular industry, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's human resources, you do have to learn to speak the language and understand the landscape, which is sort of why I put that in the bottom right there. My goal, as I have given this presentation to others, has been to explain the landscape, introduce the technology, and focus on the education component, whether it's the education of the election officials, the information technology staff, or the audience that may figure out where they might lean in someday to this ecosystem and this process. So, to start the story, um, I would say a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. More accurately, it is a long time ago in a state uh, called Florida. Several of you were probably not born, or you were probably born right around the time that this happened. But if you don't know, in 2000, the election between Al Gore and George W. Bush was a fairly contentious one. And that is because it was a time of hanging chads. What happened in, the most prominent event was that um, voting machines used in Florida were hole punch voting machines. You actually punched a hole through a piece of paper to indicate who you were voting for. Um, those little buttons that pop out of the holes are called chads, and the big dispute between who actually won or how votes were counted, the big dispute came from the people looking at ballots and determining voter intent. So imagine now some of you vote probably by marking, or you took standardized tests where you actually mark a circle, um, and to indicate your answer, or in this case to indicate your vote. If you're not perfect in that circle, or if you put an X through that circle, or if you make a circle outside, if you make a circle outside of the actual circle, then typically a machine can't read that, or a human has to make a determination about what your intent was, just like a teacher might evaluate what your intent was. So, um, the big takeaway here is the voting machines that were used in Florida created an air of determination. where determination of the voter intent was very important in determining whether that vote counted or whether that vote went for one candidate or another. So, as a result of that 2000 election between Bush and Gore, the federal government created something called the Help America Vote Act. I'll refer to that as HAVA in the future. And the two biggest mandates of that legislation was it mandated that all polling place, each polling location had to have a voting system that was accessible to voters with disabilities, and that all states had to go to a centralized voter registration system. Now, there are a couple of models. The federal government made that mandate that all states had to go to that centralized voter registration system, but they left it up to the states to determine how that was implemented. So we have, you'll see there in that middle section, there's a top down or a bottom up VR system. In West Virginia, we happen to be top down. That means that the statewide voter registration system lives at the state level, and counties, we have 55 counties in our state that administer the election at the local level. Those states have access to that statewide voter registration database, but we host it at the state level at the top. So we're top down. Someone like our neighbor in Ohio, they're a bottom up. 88 counties in Ohio, 88 disparate voter registration systems, and they send their data at a frequency up to the state where it's aggregated so that state information is available again at that statewide level. So you've either got the disparate local jurisdictions who maintain the data and then send copies of it, at a frequency up to the state level, or the state hosts that database, provides a platform for the counties to access, and that's ours. We're a top-down station or state. So the biggest impacts of HAVA, that Help America Vote Act, it created a federal agency called the Election Assistance Commission that have responsibilities for certifying voting systems, for developing guidelines for voting systems. They work in close conjunction with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. As Chris indicated, NIST, they work with them to develop those guidelines. And there's a technical guidelines development committee out of that Election Assistance Commission that leans in and provides technical guidance and assistance and expertise towards the guidelines that are created. When HAVA was passed, and it was passed in 2002, funding was sent down from the federal government to the states to implement the plans that to carry out the mandates that were directed by that legislation, and that legislation was intended to improve the entire election process for federal elections around the country. Um, the way that we approached it, we initially, as a state, got that money from the federal government. We gave grants to the county so that they could buy their own um, voting equipment, which included the DREs, which are touchscreen voting systems. So, just a brief description of the different kinds of voting systems. Some of you may have used, some of you may have seen. There's either an on-screen, what they call a DRE, direct record electronic, where you actually, it's like a tablet or a phone or anything. You make your choices, and typically that machine will spit out a ballot of your choices that then is run through an electronic tabulator. Some actually have the ballot as a piece of paper, and as I described before, you might actually mark circles to indicate who you're voting for, and then that hand marked ballot is run through an electronic tabulator. So in our state, we happen to be fortunate. Um, the EAC, as I described earlier, they certify certain systems. The way our state plan around HAVA was developed years ago, it's that we cannot use a voting system that is not approved or certified by the Election Assistance Commission. Our state law says that we can only use voting systems that are approved by the EAC. So that limits the type of machines that we can use, but it makes it very simple. We just have one vendor for our voting systems. That's the systems that we actually vote on. We just have one vendor, which makes it very simple. Several states, including our neighbor to the west, Ohio, they have probably four or five. So that makes it very simple for us. Um, Another impact of HAVA is that voter registration data became available at the state level. And as most of you know, the more data that's made available, the more consumers of that data there are, and the more data that they want. So that was voter registration data, absentee data, provisional ballot data. And for those of you that don't know, there's something called a provisional ballot. Here's where some of the election education comes in. You should never ever leave a polling place without being given the opportunity to vote. That's one of my soapbox phrases for all of you about the election process is that you should never go to a polling place, whether it's during early voting or on election day. You should never go to a polling place and not have an opportunity to vote. If you go to a polling place, you're not on the books registered to vote, or you happen to show up at a precinct that's incorrect for you for whatever reason, you are not on the list of eligible voters at that precinct or at that voting location. It doesn't matter. You still should be given a ballot. And if there's a question about your registration, then you will vote what's called a provisional ballot. And that ballot will be considered at canvass after the election is over. There's a canvassing board in the local jurisdiction that's going to determine after researching, maybe it was a typo, maybe you were assigned to the wrong precinct. They're going to determine whether or not your vote counts. And that's what is called a provisional ballot. If there's some question about your vote at the precinct or where you voted or your registration, the canvassing board after the election will consider that after researching the details of the mismatch, so to speak, and they'll determine whether or not your vote counts. Candidate information also became available at that state level. So imagine all of the voter registration information all of a sudden in one source where a candidate running for office or a campaign manager or a party, one of the parties, has access to voter registration data, voting history data, absentee and provisional data. All of that is all of a sudden available at the statewide level, and those entities don't have to go to each of the counties or each of the local jurisdictions to gather it. So that was a big switch as far as making data available. And that began that interconnected system uh, of data sharing and the big data that was available. And most importantly, at that time, because you were talking about statewide data, statewide platforms that have to be able to aggregate or ingest information, and voting machines that are electronic and not just based on paper, that for the first time joins IT and election administration in a really big way. So if you want to take a look at this screen now, um, this is where that election officials as IT managers started to come in. This again was drafted by that same person to describe or to show how many individual technology related systems or platforms or devices could have to interact with one another from the start to the finish of an election cycle. Um, so you can sort of just breeze through there and look. There's a voting system, there's a voter registration system, there are e-poll books, there are election night reporting systems, there are voter authentication systems, there's UACAVA ballot and delivery, poll worker training systems. So several different disparate platforms, devices, or systems that may or may not in some way have to communicate with one another. So imagine an election official, a county clerk, and their staff. Um, who may or may not be tech savvy. Now, all of a sudden, they have to speak intelligently or understand or have someone who can assist them moving and navigating through all of these disparate systems. Um, 20 years ago is when this started. So, if you think back to where we were with technology, still a lot of mainframes, a lot of ASCII terminals, Windows, commonly used mice, you know, actual mice, not so commonly used. So introducing election administrators and technology at that time was a pretty big threshold that was crossed. Most of you may or may not be should be aware, I guess, that our election system in the U.S. is largely decentralized. All 50 states have elections and have a chief election official. In our case, it's our Secretary of State. In others, it's a board of elections that oversees it. But each state is is charged with conducting elections. Within each of the states, then there are then local jurisdictions that actually conduct the physical election from start to finish. We're more of a parent organization. The feds tell us what to do. We then have to tell the counties what to do from the state level, but it all runs downhill to the county. The county or the local jurisdictions, in some states, it's cities or municipalities that conduct the elections, but it is up to them. And that makes that system very decentralized and creates less of a broad attack surface when it comes to threatening something like an election. These three posts here, these three squares or triangle or rectangles, if you will, banners, whatever you want to call these describe the three significant uh, arenas or landscapes or atmospheres, if you will, of the elections ecosystem. Pre-election, lots of things are connected. Lots of things are public facing. It is a rather, in our case, a vendor light atmosphere, meaning that not as many vendors are as involved as are our personnel, our staff, and it is very interface heavy. On election day, state law requires none of our voting machines can be connected to the internet in any way. It is a very disconnected, intentionally atmosphere. On election day, it's not connected. It is very private. It is very vendor heavy because there are voting system vendors in the space. And there are only a few nationwide. There are really only a handful, maybe a half a dozen really big players in the voting system vendor space. So it is very vendor heavy, but it's very interface light, again, because of its disconnected property. And then post election, that space, that atmosphere is connected again. It's public facing, again, goes back to vendor light in most cases and back to interface heavy. We'll get in, you'll be able to understand those concepts a little better as we start to walk through each of these atmospheres. So, in that pre election atmosphere, where it is very connected, public facing, vendor light, interface heavy, you have things like um, this larger subsection campaigns and candidates. You got to have people to run for office to have an election. So the components of that particular phase of this section is the ballot definitions, creating the ballots based on the districts and the people running for it, for election within those districts. Um, and as I start to go through these, the intent is for you to, again, I go back to the decentralization and sort of explaining the landscape, and you as cybersecurity practitioners, as technologists, the intent here is to indicate where there may be an entry point or an attack surface or some place that could be compromised within the elections process and within the elections ecosystem. So when you think about campaigns, candidates, people running for office, people designing the ballots, and there are vendors who do that, who create the ballots for us. There are election or ballot definitions that are created and stored somewhere, maybe in the cloud, maybe on the vendor's hardware itself. You've got emails going back and forth. You've got websites that show sample ballots. You've got websites that show campaign information, candidate information. So it is very public facing, lots of web, lots of email traffic going through there. That voter registration system that we host, there are list maintenance interfaces. We've got, when you go to the DMV, as you're transacting at the DMV, you can opt to register to vote or update your voter registration. That comes in a nightly transfer from the DMV to us. Automated voter registration, same thing. Any of the places where you can go and transact and update your voter registration. The Department of Corrections, one of the maintenance items that we have is felons and anyone on parole, they're not eligible to vote. until their sentence is cleared if they're under conviction of felony. So we get a list from the Department of Corrections of people who are under conviction of felony or on parole still, have not completed their sentence. We run that against the voter registration database and provide that information to the county. If someone's convicted of a felony and they're registered to vote, then they have to be removed from the voter rolls. We do have an online voter registration system that we stand up. You can register to vote online. And the way that works is you go online to a platform that we host, you enter your information, go through a couple of verification checks. It does a call to the DMV. If the information that you enter is correct, then it comes to us, and then we distribute it through that voter registration system to the counties to process that voter registration application. We at the Secretary of State's office don't we don't do anything to the voter records. We provide all of the information from these connectivity points. We provide it to the counties. The county is actually who registers someone to vote, cancels the registration, or handles that. And then we've got voter lookup tools where you can go online and check your voter registration to make sure that the information is correct. So again, public facing or interconnected systems that are potential attack surfaces. Um, Printed electronic poll books, absentee voting. Without going into too much detail, poll books are printed out of that VR system. They go to the precincts that shows poll workers who are eligible to vote. That shows who the voters are that are eligible to vote. That's either printed or it's sent in a transmission and a download to an electronic poll book. You've got absentee voters, people who are voting in person early voting locations. That happens 13 days before the election. You can go vote early if you can't vote on election day. That is considered in-person absentee voting. Absentee voting happens if you can't vote on election day. So you're in-person early voting during that period as an absentee. That creates locations. Maybe voting on election day happens at all of the precincts around the county. Early voting typically only happens in one location or just a couple of locations. So if you think of a satellite location that has to have access to that poll book or to look up things in the VR system, then you've got new MAC addresses, you've got new public IP addresses. What is that satellite location? What's the cyber posture of that location? Is it a public space? Is it a privately controlled space? So you start to expand the realm of where this information is being displayed or accessed. UOCAVA voters, that's uniformed or overseas um, voters. That's people in the military, their spouses, or people living overseas who still maintain a registration in their local jurisdiction and they still want to vote. I'm not sure if anybody is aware of this or has been following this. Back in 18, we were the first state to offer to our military and their spouses the opportunity to vote on a phone using a mobile app. Um, the second incarnation of that happened in 20, but we moved to a web platform because um, the legislature made it available to persons with a disability. And that means actually voting online. And that's a very controversial subject, primarily because of the cyber risk. Um, but that's a much deeper dig into that platform and those options. But um, suffice it to say that anyone living overseas or members of the military that are displaced from their jurisdiction and their spouse can request a ballot. And those ballots are either sent through email, fax, the mail, or in the case of the UOCAVA, the military and the disabled voters and the voters living overseas, they can avail themselves of the online or the e-ballot delivery system that we stand up. There's also ballot tracking systems that are included there. So the point here is there is a lot of connectivity in this pre-election space. It's public facing, and there are a lot of transmission methods that could be intercepted um, as an attack surface. On election day, we go completely off the connectivity space. Nothing can be connected. It happens in a vacuum, right? And again, back to those poll books, whether printed or electronic, those are used at the voting location. The voting systems, they capture the votes, they tabulate the vote. We have a requirement in our state, and this is the adopted model going through most of the United States now, is that any electronic voting system must have a voter verifiable paper trail. That means that the voter needs to be able to see a piece of paper that indicates the choices that they have made. So, in the example of the DRE, where you actually touch the screen and you mark the candidates that you choose, and it spits out a piece of paper that you know reflects that. That is your paper trail, the ballot that's spit out, and you should review that to make sure that the choices are accurate. If you're using a printed ballot that you have to mark, that is your paper that you are verifying. I know I am marking the circle, and then you hand that over. So a voter verifiable paper trail. One of the challenges is for those DREs, those touch screens, the paper trail used to be, and in some instances still is being used, but that paper trail is like a receipt roll that goes in the machine. A lot of people criticize that because it's a little more difficult for the voter to verify that. But we, by and large, as a state, are moving away from that particular technology just because it's outdated. And again, it doesn't sort of satisfy that voter verifiable paper trail in a way that that the industry and sort of the atmosphere demands. Just ballot on demand. That's another printing mechanism at the polls that can happen. Um, Reporting the removable media, air gap, chain of custody, that is, we'll talk about that in the post-election, but that is part of the voting system um, that happens. It may be a definition, it may be something that has to move from one machine to another within this disconnected space. So you're familiar with the concept of air gaps, removable media, and most importantly, that chain of custody. Who has possession of that removable device, and are they using it appropriately? Within that election day, there may be some soft reporting, local and state. Some counties will produce a tally of the votes as they come through, or maybe initially an early voting and absentee counted group. They may do that. So there is some soft reporting that happens within election day, but it's just to satisfy internal ingesters only. So in the post-election space, election night reporting is just what it says. Consumers of information around elections are growing more and more impatient. So as soon as the polls close on an election day, there are people wanting results. And the most important thing to remember about that particular night and that particular platform is that those results are unofficial. Anything that you see on election night, they're unofficial because they have not been canvassed. And the provisional ballots that I talked about have not been counted at that time. So whatever comes out on election night is unofficial. It's the initial count. It's consider it a draft of the results because there is a process that happens over the next ensuing days that will then make those results official. We do contract with a vendor to display our election results on election night. We used to design that in house, um, but because of some of the mechanics of the way that information was maintained without getting too inside baseball, it was a little bit clunky, and so we've moved to a vendor that makes that ingestion and that display much easier and much more efficient. So, but on election night, those results are official. Once the results are made official after the canvassing process, and once they're certified by the local jurisdiction, then a new upload is presented, and then clearly on the website it says official, not unofficial. And then this website allows you to download them if you're looking for molecular level results. Um, and some jurisdictions, some places use APIs. They export that information to another one. We've actually got a couple of scrapers, like I think the AP scrapes that site and actually gets it so that they can post it to theirs. We have some news outlets that grab downloads and then they post those results. And the most important thing to consider here is um, is the accuracy and the understanding of whether it's official or unofficial. And I'll bring up an example of something that happened in 2014 between, of all people, Russia and Ukraine. My boss likes to quote Stalin, who said, "It doesn't matter who votes, that it's not who votes that count, it's who counts the votes." So back in 2014, there was a pro-Russia candidate and a pro-Ukraine candidate running for the presidency of the Ukraine. On election night or during election day, Russia hacked the election night reporting or the election day reporting, that election site, and flipped the results to make it look like the pro-Russia candidate was winning, when in fact the pro-Ukraine candidate was winning. Once Ukraine got control of the site back, they flipped the results to what they actually were, which was that the pro-Ukraine uh, or anti-Russia candidate was winning, and in fact actually won. But what happened during that time was the pro-Russia people, when the fake results were up, the pro-Russia people were happy, and the pro-Ukraine people were sad or mad. We'll call it mad. When the correct results were posted, then the pro-Ukraine people were happy and the pro-Russia people were mad. But that flip gave both groups the opportunity to doubt what that website was reporting, right? So when it was in favor of one and it flipped, they thought, well, you guys changed that. That's wrong. Or vice versa. And that becomes important later, and I'm sure I'm not telling you something you don't know, but now that's sort of the environment we're in now. But that happened in 2014. So the takeaway here is find the trusted source. Don't always believe what's posted until you verify the source, especially when it comes to elections. Um, some of you may have heard of risk limiting audits. Those are happening around the US now. Um, Typically, most states have some sort of auditing process, and it's variable, and typically a variable percentage of the precincts have to be hand counted. In our state, we do have an audit process after each county is required to hand count using those paper trails, the paper ballots in whatever form it comes in. The counties are required to hand count 3% of their precincts. And basically, any type of audit like that is making sure that the paper matches the electronic tabulation. So if you've got ballots printed out or ballots hand marked that are run through a tabulator, you take a certain percentage of those ballots and you hand count them to make sure that the match or that the total matches what the machine told you the total was. Um, New technology or newer technology in the auditing process is GIS. Obviously, that makes sure that or helps better make sure that the right ballot goes to the right person, and that the person, based on where they are, is voting for the right slate of candidates according to the jurisdiction they live in. That's for determining ballot assignment. It's also post-election to make sure that people are assigned to the right precinct, the right district, that kind of thing. And then, so it becomes very important, again, when you talk about who counts the results that are reported, whether they're official or unofficial, you need to develop a trusted source that displays transparency, that displays competency, and that can fight disinformation. Um, I want to go back through those because if you're paying attention to the news, or if you're interested in the elections ecosystem whatsoever, if you pay attention to politics, elections, whatever you want to call it, those are the things that are being challenged um, in everything elections. Transparency, is this group being transparent? Is this group competent? And are we faced with disinformation? How do we avoid that? So I'm going to take a moment right now to take a drink, take a break. I'm going to show you a cool picture of cat shooting laser out of its eyes. And this psychedelic data cat represents those three: voting information project, common data format, public disclosure campaigns. These are three projects that I've been involved with in the now 17 years since I've been in this space. Again, as election technology and election administration sort of join. Um, it's the elections industry, the elections technology industry has branded itself, and these are three important projects. Voting information project is about officially sourcing voter registration and candidate information. Common data format, a lot of you can understand that is a challenge when you look at the disparate systems that we talked about, devices, platforms, things like that, getting them to all speak the same language, even if it's just a column header or a field name. Sometimes that becomes a molecular, very complex discussion, and it's been my great privilege to work in those spaces over the last several years. So when I first became CIO in 2017 and started talking to the county clerks and the local administrators um, about this ecosystem, or about cybersecurity, they kept asking me, Dave, why are we talking about cybersecurity so much? Well, you remember the graphic Bush Gore, Star Wars. If we use that analogy, that got very complicated in 2016. If you look at some of these headlines, state voter registration systems easy to hack. Voting machine supplier exposes 1.8 million voter records in a breach. How a 16-year-old hacked a voting machine this weekend. Russia is still targeting U.S. elections. All of these things actually happened in 2016 that changed the narrative about elections. Up until that point, cybersecurity was not necessarily a word that was in the vocabulary of all election administrators and even election technologists. Election administrators for decades have been trying to run the most accurate, efficient elections, and have done a very good job of it. For decades, IT professionals have been trying to secure networks and prevent intrusions and breaches and protect their systems and their networks, and they've done a very good job of it. But now these two groups are being brought together because of these incidents that happened in 16. The email accounts of the DNC, Mitt Romney, and Hillary Clinton were all hacked. Arizona and Illinois voter registration databases were breached. One state was actually because of a SQL injection vulnerability that was known for 10 years. One was socially compromised user credentials. So there were entities that got into two statewide voter registration databases. Um, I've highlighted the word, so there was press around that 21 or 39 states were targeted. I've emboldened the word target because that kind of stuff needs defined. We started hearing around 2016 the word hack more times than I can count, and it became very alarming because everyone had their own definition of what hacked means. And the example that I use now is if anybody gets a spoofed Facebook account. They go on Facebook and they say, "Hey, I've been hacked." No, no, you haven't. You haven't been hacked. Someone is spoofing you. The the vocabulary and you have to define, especially in the ransomware space. You have to define what you're talking about. What we do in cybersecurity and what we do in IT, and especially what we do in elections, is not a 5-second soundbite. But people start to glaze over when you start to get into the details. If your great aunt says that she's been hacked because somebody got a message from somebody that looks like her on Facebook, you're going to have a tough time explaining to her the difference between hack and spoof. Maybe, unless your great aunt is, fairly tech savvy. But that's what I mean. So the press that came out around all of these incidents in 2016 needed defined, but they weren't for a really long time. So the public basically interpreted all of these news stories as if the election got hacked. AWS storage was part of that, right? Somebody had a default setting in their AWS storage account where voter registration information was stored, and somebody stumbled upon it. Luckily, it was a good guy who notified the state, and they locked it down. The DEF CON e-poll book. Somebody bought an e-poll book which had voter registration information off of eBay from the state of Tennessee, and whoever had it in the state of Tennessee didn't clean it off. They didn't wipe it. They just put it on eBay and sold it. So somebody took that to DEF CON and said, look, all they had to do was get into the box and they had access to voter registration information. That's not the same thing as breaching a voter registration database. More things that we can go into there as well, but the emboldened one, and obviously, IRA out of Russia was actually charged and fined, as a result of the Mueller report. They discovered that they were responsible for a lot of the activity around the election in 2016. But social media became the battle space back then, and what we learned was um, that the networks by and large were fine. It was how it was propagated on social media and in the media that actually started to sow the seeds of distrust in the way elections were being run. So, because of what happened in 2016, elections was designated critical infrastructure. And again, think HAVA, think the Help America Vote Act. The Bush Gore election calls the federal government to create federal legislation to improve the election process. Well, the federal government did it again after 2016, and they designated elections as critical infrastructure because there were nation states actually poking around in our elections ecosystem. So, if any of you are familiar with the Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, the MSISAC, they actually created an EIISAC, meaning an Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center, sprang from designating elections as critical infrastructure. There was a government coordinating council and a sector coordinating council stood up as well. There is a government coordinating council and a sector coordinating council for any of the critical infrastructure sectors. Think water, electric, nuclear. There are government representatives who guide its journey through critical infrastructure, and there are sector, meaning vendor or private sector coordinating councils that sort of guide these industries in their path through critical infrastructure. There were missteps around communicating what happened in 2016, and it's very similar to the way 9/11 worked. There were three-letter agencies, the FBI, the DHS. There were all these entities, law enforcement entities, that had pieces of the 9/11 puzzle, but they didn't have the protocols and the ability to share that information, which is what allowed 9/11 to happen. One of the things that allowed 9/11 to happen. Same thing, people that were noticing activity on networks or systems around elections were notifying maybe Danielle, who you guys heard from earlier. Maybe they were notifying the state CISO. They weren't notifying the election officials. So as a result of that designation, what's happened now is election officials actually have secret clearances. Some of us on the staff have secret clearances where we can get access to those intelligence briefings that might help uh, create actionable items where we can help defend things around the elections ecosystem. There were task forces stood up, several deliverables, obviously people in the space, the big ones, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft became involved. Harvard Belfer Center, we worked with extensively to create a tabletop exercise around election administration and the elections technology. And those other alphabet soup things there are just organizations that we're a member of or that we work with, National Association of State Election Directors, that kind of thing. So the goals of these voting enthusiasts, these people who want to tinker around, it is not really any secret now, right? Again, like Chris said, they're there to harvest credentials. They're there to harvest information, voter registration information, or they're looking for an entry point so that they can go in and change voter data or change election results. They're there to expose weaknesses in the elections ecosystem and the networking. They're there as a redirect, right? If they get us paying attention to what's happening in election, and they do a couple of things. You guys know how cyber, actors work, right? They get a hook in and they look to explode it at just the right time. Well, if you explode a hook, then you've got all the attention directed over here. Meanwhile, they're trying to do something over here where you're not looking. The biggest thing is they're looking to erode confidence. When you're talking about someone like Russia or North Korea or Iran, their tactics, and you guys know this well, their tactics are they make themselves look better by making us look bad. And that's not limited to US elections, just like what happened in Ukraine, right? You build yourself up by tearing other people down. That's how people work. When a country goes after a county, it's not a fair fight, right? And that's what was happening. Countries, entire nation states were bringing their resources to bear against, at some point, at some instances, against local jurisdictions. Dimitri from CrowdStrike. There are two kinds of organizations, those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. Again, we go back to that word, hacked. And it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. Chasing a false positive, chasing a false narrative is like chasing the dragon's tail. Once it gets out there, it is really, really hard to disprove a false positive. And I bring these quotes up because when all this stuff started happening, and because of this designation, excuse me, when this happened, then we started to have the conversation with the counties about their role as the tip of the battle spear in this fight. Elections are handled at the local jurisdiction, right? What cyber posture, what protections, what knowledge do counties or local jurisdictions have? What resources do they have to protect against a nation state or sophisticated cyber actors? Right? So we started having the dialogue with the counties and the local jurisdictions. And I don't mean just we at the West Virginia Secretary of State's office and our counties, but this started happening everywhere. If you were a bad actor, if you were a nation state looking to infiltrate an elections ecosystem, would you start at the Secretary of State's office or would you start at the Office of Technology? No, you'd probably start in Clay County or Work County, West Virginia, or Gallia County, Ohio, or wherever, right? So we had to start talking to counties and local jurisdictions about their role in protecting against bad things happening to the elections ecosystem. So again, that interaction between IT and elections intensifies with vocabulary. The biggest question was, do you know where you are vulnerable? And do you know who is responsible for protecting you in all of those spaces? Remember the big map of all the interconnected systems or all of the disparate devices and platforms and systems. Do you know who is responsible for protecting you against what? Because you've got voting system vendors that are responsible for their section. You have us at the Secretary of State's office responsible for protecting our space. And you've got counties responsible for protecting their space. And then if you look very quickly, at the attack surfaces, I know I'm creeping up on end of time. Patrick, start playing the music if you got to like play me off stage. Um, but these attack surfaces, these are obviously well known to you guys. But again, when you start to talk about people who don't think cyber, don't understand their role in this protection scheme, then you have to explain network connectivity hardware, making sure that they understand that the personal digital profile is still connected to the work digital profile. Again, what Chris is saying about pet name passwords, and do you use the same passwords and credentials on social platforms? Are you accessing it at work? Software, whether it's web applications, OSs, how many times have we heard that a breach has become a breach because of known but unmitigated vulnerabilities? And a lot of times that's just updating, patching OSs, applications, and email is the biggest target because of phishing, because of whaling, because of what is possible through there. And then those pesky humans, social engineering, honest mistake errors, controls that they have, chain of custody, password frequency, password complexity, physical security is a big thing as well. Can you get into a space that has sensitive data? I'm not telling you anything you don't know. It's just important to know that this is a difficult sometimes uh, conversation to have with the people downstream. And so what we did, we worked with the Department of Homeland Security to create these last mile posters, which include initiatives that give them low-hanging fruit in some instances, checklists up at the top. It's register with that EII so that you get threat intel, sharing information, you get spotlights, you get vocabulary, you get counseling on best practices. Sign up for several free services that DHS and CISA and the ISAC provides, like free vulnerability scans, malicious domain blocking, um, platforms, things that are free. Sign up for one of those. Schedule a remote pen test. Adopt a more secure .gov domain. You know, just initiatives, things that they might be able to accomplish, low hanging fruit, where they can put a check mark and say, I've done something to improve my cyber posture. Then you've got these important numbers, red flags, response steps, actions that you can take, such as training against social engineering, explaining what DDoS is. These are contact numbers. And again, we go back to that pre-election, election, and post-election atmospheres, and things like two-factor and security training in pre-election. So you've got, threats and mitigation, safeguards you can put in place, awareness and reporting, reporting, reporting. The weird little nuance to working in a political office or in a political space around elections. A lot of times, vulnerabilities or cyber events can sometimes look like a failure to someone who is hired or elected to a position. So reporting sometimes goes unannounced because they're afraid of getting in trouble or looking bad to the constituents. So it's a weird nuance around the space we're in. And these are things, obviously, that you're well aware of, I'm sure. Established baselines, the best practices, continuing education, have an incident response plan, write it, post it, test it, developing controls, contingency of operations planning, continuity of operations planning, rather. Never did that become more important than the 2020 election, not because of necessarily cyber, but because of the pandemic and a lot of people needing to vote via absentee. That changed processes considerably. It also, the pandemic created remote locations, more satellite locations for certain things, people accessing critical systems from home. How do you go through that when they're accessing it from home? How much reach do you have into the cybersecurity posture of someone at home accessing your critical systems while their kids are gaming or uh, at home, being homeschooled, accessing other systems? So the engagements Chris talked about, do a risk assessment, security research. There was another round of funding that came through the federal government that we then distributed again as grants to help the counties implement some of these. Um, you know, a $2,200 firewall was very expensive when nobody had a budget for it, but when you actually have a cyber event or you're threatened with a cyber event and there's federal funding, all of a sudden that firewall becomes far more accessible. So that was a quick rundown of that last mile poster. And this one I just added because how it started was in 16, what Russia and other states did turned the attention to the cyber posture of the election ecosystem. What's happening now, and I just chose Mike Lindell. If nobody knows, Mike Lindell's the CEO of My Pillow. He has been involved in a campaign to question the legitimacy of the 2020 election. And that group still talks, still approaches, and still questions the legitimacy. This is not a political statement for me. It's not anything other than this is the space that we're operating in now. We've taken steps to mitigate the sort of threat or the just the damage or potential threat or damage to the elections ecosystem. We've adapted policies and communication protocols and funding and best practices and education. We've done that. Now we're operating in a space where people are accessing those same resources or getting that same data, and they're using it to weaponize in their own narrative. It doesn't matter how you think. You guys know, especially if you're the age and where you are in life, if you're at the age and in that space, like I think you are, you understand the concept of dissonance on social media and in the media and even on the front porch. CISA had a nice campaign about disinformation or misinformation built around pineapple on pizza. They started a campaign, and it was all in good fun, but it really it was to illustrate how divisive something can become because you are so passionate about your opinion and you are so passionate about the opinion of your own echo chamber that you can weaponize something like pineapple on pizza. It was all in good fun for the most part, but a simple concept like pineapple on pizza can create warring factions that do nothing but build within their own echo chamber and weaponize whatever resource, whether it's data, whether it's platforms, whether it's mistakes, whether it's vulnerabilities, anything can be used to weaponize to amplify your own narrative. So early on in Secretary Warner's administration, as we were faced with this movement into critical infrastructure, we adopted the protect, detect, correct platform, do our best to protect the ecosystem, detect any intrusions, and then correct and remediate any and mitigate any damage. Partners that we work closely with through this space. Obviously, the Office of Technology, the National Guard has been a tremendous partner in risk assessments, penetration testing, and watching our six on election night and around election day, that kind of thing. The West Virginia Fusion Center, Fusion and Intelligence Center, all of the alphabet, CISA, DHS, FBI, MOG, what they call MOG, that's the transmission entities, people who provide email, um, ISPs and things like that. CIS Center for Internet Security and those ISACs we talked about. Again, the elections organizations and MSPs, tech vendors, election vendors. And the last thing that I will say is how you as a community can get involved. Any of those surfaces that you saw in my presentation, you can always reach out to see how you can lend your expertise. One of the things I might be looking at your community for doing, we are in the process of creating our vulnerability disclosure program, meaning that we will post, not for reward, not for money, but just bragging rights, a vulnerability policy on our website. All the platforms that we control, we would reach out, much like a bug bounty program with unfortunately no bounty, just security researchers to test our platforms so that the good guys find it before the bad guys. So, however, in that ecosystem that you guys with your expertise can lean in, and that goes for the gaming community as well. I've done just a brief a bit of research about you guys, and the kind of things that you do. You've got a cyber side, you've got a gaming side. What Chris was talking about, those tabletop exercises that we've helped create, and the security awareness training, tabletop exercises is something that we're interested in continuing. We had a statewide one several years ago where we ran the counties through injects and cyber threats, that kind of thing. And I think that tabletop exercise space is a great place for the gamers to look into, and obviously those of you focused on cyber can lean in with your skill set. Get involved, even if that doesn't mean with your skill set. If that means going to vote, that's the biggest thing I can ask you to do is get involved in voting. That is that is one of our prized, cherished rights. And if you don't at least vote, please do that. Become a poll worker, or any other way that you can insert yourself or participate in the ecosystem at the county or the state level. Um, TTPs, intel sharing, anything that you guys, it's probably a pipe dream, but at some point I would like to get started a little better info sharing and intel sharing around all segments of the community, whether that's at the county, the municipal, the technical and community college, the universities, the state, everything. Um, that that's the gold mine, right? I mean, it's so nice when you don't have to reinvent the wheel and somebody tells you about what they're seeing, so that you can add that to your list of protectorates. And then most importantly, amplify the correct info. don't amplify misinformation. If you don't know what you're talking about around the elections ecosystem, don't propagate false information or information that you can't verify. Do act as a trusted source and amplify the correct information. And if you don't know the correct information, you can always reach out to your local or your state representative, and ask. So on that note, I think I'm a little over, not too far over, but I hope that was helpful. And I'm ready for any questions if anybody has any, Patrick.
Okay. Actually, Patrick is in another session right now.
Oh, great. Hi, Scott.
Yes, I just jumped in here with you. This is Scott Nicholas, and I'm another professor here. I actually do cybersecurity classes mostly, but just from looks, I'd say like maybe you're a little younger than me, and so I know when you were talking about the evolution of balloting systems and everything. I'm old school, and I just kind of really miss that throwing the handle deal, and
Yeah.
yeah, there was something satisfying about that. You really felt like you voted when you did that.
Right.
But
big levers. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there was no hanging Chad question or anything like that.
Right.
I was really, really interested in the entire, presentation that you gave, because there were a lot of things in there. I had no idea all the interconnections that went on in there, and one thing that I found interesting was the GIS information that you were talking about. So when you're doing your regular balloting, day of the election or whatever, so does the ballot get geotagged? Is that how it's verified that it's coming actually from the polling place that you think it's coming from, or using that information in a different way?
Yeah, no, GIS right now is we're in the infant stages of using GIS just for district assignment as far as voter registration goes.
So they get the right ballot.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah, and so and I'm not sure if you're aware, we're going through a redistricting process. Every 10 years, the census data is collected, and based on that population information, then states and localities have to adjust their districts. So we went from, because of our population decline, we went from 3 congressional districts down to 2.
Oh.
And that then filters down. We also went to single member house districts. So there are no more 3 and 4 delegates to a house district. There used to be 67, now there are 100. So with only 1 member elected out of each of those 100 House of Delegates district for our legislature. Based on population, also, the counties are charged with adjusting their magisterial districts and their precinct boundaries. So if there's a population decline, then you may shrink or you may grow a precinct, or if there's a population increase, like in Berkeley County, then you may have to create 2 precincts, so that there's a minimum number. There's a maximum number of residents or registered voters that you can have assigned to a particular precinct, all based on population, and it all goes down to boundaries. Well, the legislature, what's actually written in the book, the code book, is boundary. It's a narrative. Runs from this lat long point to here to this lat long point. It's a narrative description of basically what we understand as a shapefile in GIS now. So we're incorporating GIS now to assist the counties in evaluating that their boundaries are correct and making sure that their voters, because they have to change that district information in the voter registration system. So when you talk about that poll book printing or the e-poll book export, the district and precinct information has to be accurate so that those poll books, whether electronic or printed, are accurate. So right now, GIS is just going into the voter registration system. I like your idea of geocoding somehow, though. The ballot itself, I would say as we go, especially since we've breached the idea of online voting. We voted with the mobile app in 18. We're voting, online with an e-ballot delivery system in 20, or did in 20, and we're doing that again in 22. Location becomes very interesting when it comes to verifying that someone is who they say they are.
Yeah.
We don't have a voter impersonation problem by and large. Typically, any sort of any election crime is usually around election administration, not voter impersonation. But when you start talking about technologies that are used overseas, especially on a mobile device, that could be one additional means of authentication. Face recognition, biometrics, or geolocation. So
Yeah. Well, do you feel like the big increase in absentee voting has kind of made things less secure?
I'm always fond of saying that the digital typically has to reproduce the brick and mortar, right? When you look at a digital solution, it typically reproduces the paper or the brick and mortar solution. So there are people who, election purists don't like the idea of online or electronic voting by and large. They want to go back to paper. But if you think about it, um, ballot harvesting and impersonating, like, my wife or my daughter could sign my wife's signature better than my wife can, right? I'm sure that's probably commonplace, right?
The assistant's the same way. Yeah.
And so the signature, that wet ink signature, is the method of validation for absentee ballots. That's up to a human to validate that the signature on file in the voter registration database matches the one that's on the outside of that absentee ballot. Yes, I think an increase in absentee ballots creates, again, another attack surface that
Yeah.
someone could intercept. The thing about elections, especially since it's so decentralized, um, to actually be able to influence the outcome of an election through either that paper interception or that digital interception, it's high effort, low yield. If you were to actually compromise, say, a set of voting machines in one precinct, you're still only compromising and affecting the results within that one precinct. Um,
Uh-huh.
and to be able to do that, that's a lot of effort. That's a lot of pre-work. That's a lot of recon. That's a lot of technical, expertise within that space. That's high effort, but again, low yield. You're only impacting that. So the attack surface, the only way in a paper or digital situation is if you get to something more high, more top down, higher in the hierarchy from a top down thing. If I really wanted to influence the outcome of an election, I'd come after me, not the county, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
does make sense. I mean, the fatter the target, the more likely that you're going to get somebody coming after you. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
well, I got to tell you, Dave, you did a great job, and it was so interesting. I really want to thank you so much for coming and talking to us today, because it's been really, really informative. And I would, invite you now to come back next time. Because
Sounds
we
great.
really did enjoy it. So.
Well, I appreciate the offer, and like I said, it's easy to talk about because we're very passionate about it. It is one of our fundamental rights. Always happy to talk to folks, and I'm excited about what you guys do. The new I'll date myself again. I wasn't much of a gamer after something like Halo, after my kids aged out. So now it's all coming back full circle. There's a TV show about what we used to play. So
Oh, yeah. See Master Chief's face.
yes,
They're
yeah.
always, yeah, yeah, that's true. Well, I'm going to let you go, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.